Hello, welcome to Conversation with the Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, Professor of Geography at Grand Rapids Community College, and today we have Caroline Faria, Assistant Professor of Geography at Florida International University. Caroline is also our visiting geographical scientist who is delivering a special lecture for our Race, Ethnicity, and Identity Conference here, sponsored by the GRCC Social Sciences Department, the Office of the Provost, the Office of the Dean of Arts and Sciences, as well as the International Geographical Honor Society and the Association of American Geographers. Caroline, thank you for coming here and sharing with us some of your ideas on geography. And first, we'd like to talk a little bit about your background. Oh, you were raised in the UK, and can you tell us about your childhood? Were there any things that you experienced in your childhood that really might have captivated you to explore matters geographic?
Sure. Well, let's see. I'm from the Northwest, so I'm from a small town called Frodsham in between Liverpool and Manchester. So I guess growing up I was always aware that I lived in a place that, because of its ports, particularly around Liverpool, was really connected to other parts of the world. And I think remembering spending time in Liverpool and thinking about some of the connections, the historical connections between Liverpool and parts of the colonial world, particularly through the transatlantic slave trade. And that was a big part of my childhood too, because my father's Guyanese. So I have family now sort of scattered through the Caribbean and the US and Canada, as well as Guyana. And I think growing up, a lot of the conversations around the dinner table were about that sort of colonial history and the impacts of that history. And some of the early arguments I remember us having were about that. So that made me think about the ways that, places like my small town were really connected to places far, far away by certain political and economic processes.
So this place that you grew up was characterized by this rich ethnic diversity that made you wonder about the world.
Yeah.
and different peoples of the world.
Well, sure. I mean, Liverpool and Manchester were, but I was from a small town that was white, very white in many ways, but also had in certain parts immigrant communities too, from Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and the West Indies. So I think there's a way that you can live in a community like that and not be exposed to that diversity. But I sort of attended to that and noticed that. And a lot of the people, first and second generation that had migrated to the Northwest were coming from former colonial spaces. And so I think, growing up, I, of course, wasn't really in tune with the sort of political weight of that history, but that emerged for me over the years, taking geography classes, I think.
Well, that's interesting, because how we grow up in our childhoods really influences us quite a bit as we get older, and we might reflect upon these years as we see that they are really more significant influences than we've given them credit for.
Oh, sure.
So you enrolled at Leeds.
Yeah. I went to Leeds. Well, I went to Leeds to study geography, but that was very much based on taking a lot of geography classes in high school. I think because of our colonial legacy, geography as a discipline is really strong in the UK, and problematically so. But it meant that when I went to school in the 80s and 90s, then geography was a big part of the curriculum, and I loved the discipline. It was concerned with the interactions between people and place, right? So but that meant that it covered a lot of different things. So, I would study standard, stuff in high school there. I'd learn about the Green Revolution and its impacts in India, and population policy in China, erupting volcanoes in the Pacific Northwest, and I loved the diversity of it. So after high school, I chose geography as my degree, and went to Leeds after taking a year to do a bit of travel and get there.
But let's talk a little bit about the high school experience first, if you don't mind. Sure. When you were exploring these matters geographic in high school, you appear to have developed quite a bit of geographical expertise, maybe on par of what many American students might achieve by the time they are halfway through their geography majors, their bachelor's programs. Do you recall taking field trips in any of these courses throughout the countryside and experiencing the richness of exploring a landscape?
Yeah, I mean, we did some field trips at high school, for sure, and then that was an important part of the undergrad education too. And I actually teach a lot of the things that I learned in high school. You know, I just taught last week, I was teaching about the Green Revolution. So I love that I get to revisit that stuff. And I think the educational systems just work a little bit differently, so that we took fewer classes, fewer different courses, but we took them in a bit more depth. So that was why I probably got to that a little bit earlier. Certainly field trips were a really important part of learning. And although I was learning about places very far away in those geography classes, we also learned about regional politics, and at that time, Margaret Thatcher was in power, so we were learning about the impacts of her economic policies on the country, and that stuff was all really kind of formative for me in thinking about, political economy.
Excellent. And so you took a year off before going to Leeds?
Yes, I did. I did, and I think I was ready to just take a break from school, and I went traveling with a couple of friends. We went to Southern Africa and then Australia and Southeast Asia. It's a very common traveling route, I think, for some people who are able to do that. And it was great. I was in Zimbabwe and South Africa. I landed in Harare in January of 1999, which is a time when the country really started going through some pretty serious political economic upheaval. And I remember landing in Harare, and the city was in shutdown, and realizing that there was complex shifts at work.
Was that your first stop from London?
That was my first stop from Manchester. Yeah, it was the first stop.
My goodness.
Yeah, lots of people grow up with that kind of instability their whole life, so I was very, very sheltered. But I had a really wonderful few months in Southern Africa, and it really it really meant that I wanted to go back and spend more time on the continent later on, which I was able to do. After 2 years at Leeds, the department was incredibly flexible and allowed me to take another year to leave the program and spend some time working and traveling again.
And then what did you do?
That year, I volunteered at an organization called Voluntary Services Overseas, which is a little bit like Peace Corps. And so I worked in London in the day in their library, and then in the evening I sold ice cream in Soho, and worked 2 jobs to be an intern. And then I went traveling around the US. I got the Amtrak around the 2 coasts and across the middle, and then headed up to Canada, where I worked for a little while. And then I went to Ghana for the last 4 months, and I used that time to do my undergrad dissertation research work. So we have a senior thesis type thing, and I did that research there.
And can you talk about that undergrad piece of research?
Yeah, sure. I was looking at Ghana's reaction to the growth of HIV and AIDS in that country, which at that time was becoming a more serious problem. It definitely wasn't as serious as it was in other parts of the continent, but it was getting a lot of attention, and it was very much bound up with the international development industry, and it was the recipient of a lot of aid. So I was interested in how that aid was being used and what the emphasis was in terms of prevention. And the main emphasis in the first decade or so, or more actually, of the epidemic was around prevention and education, without really much of an effort towards treatment, because of all the problems around patented medications produced by big pharmaceutical companies that meant that it was unaffordable for a lot of people in those in poorer countries.
Sure.
And they weren't able to access generic medicines because of those patents. So it was there was a big contestation at the global scale, really, around sort of neoliberal policy and patent rights versus sort of the human rights question of access to medicines. And that was getting played out in Ghana. in interesting ways. So I worked in a fishing community called Choko, just west of Accra, and looked at the impacts of the epidemic in that neighborhood and how it connected to these broader governmental issues.
Was that common, by the way, for a young British student as an undergraduate to go abroad to Africa?
Well, the senior thesis, the dissertation thing, that I think is pretty integral to geography programs around the UK, and I think it's really I loved to do it. It was my first piece of independent research, and I'm sure there's some debate about whether everyone should have to do that, but I think it was a really great experience. And I mean, my fellow undergrads were all doing really interesting projects, some of them locally to the UK, in the UK, but others internationally too. I think because I took that year, I had a bit more time to spend in the field. But I mean, most people spend the whole summer doing that research, and and people produce great projects. So I would I sort of encourage undergrads as much as possible to do independent research if they can. Yeah.
Well, that's great. And then you decided you wanted to explore geography further, and you enrolled at the University of Washington for your master's degree.
Yeah, I had some great mentors at Leeds. Debbie Phillips was a really important sort of female geographic figure for me, and then Robin Butlin taught history of geography, and historical geography is where I really started learning about geography militant and colonial endeavor. And then my two advisors were Marcus Power and Adrian Bailey, and Marcus Power really got me interested in post-colonial geographies, and Adrian Bailey was working on geographies of migration. And they were all very, very encouraging about pursuing postgraduate studies, and I knew that I wanted to carry on doing that research, and a couple of the faculty, told me that there are ways to study and be funded to study in the US and Canada. So I just applied. I remembered the places that I had traveled to on the Amtrak and the places I liked, and I had stopped in Seattle for a beer, and I liked the city. And so,
and the beer was probably pretty good.
The beer was really good. And I knew Lucy Jarosa's work from undergrad, and Kim England's work, and so I was really attracted to the sort of strong feminist geographers.
You were already aware of your interest in exploring feminist geography of gender when you were an undergraduate.
Yeah, I think so, and I think I was, and I was interested in activist geography, and Audrey Kobayashi had written this piece on activist scholarship that was really important to me in a methodology, a collection that I still have and I still use. And so that was really inspiring to me. So I just knew I wanted somehow to connect activist-oriented work with sort of academic scholarship. And
that's great. There's a dearth of that, it seems, in our discipline.
Yeah, I think there's some really exciting work that's being done, and I think it's really hard to navigate that line, and I certainly am no expert at that, but I was just inspired by some geographers that I saw trying to do that work. I think for me, because my entry point to Africa, as it is for many people, is through the lens of development. And so growing up in the UK, the only sort of understanding I had of Africa really was through, Live Aid or Comic Relief or Save the Children requests for funds. And so I had this very kind of problematic and warped idea of what Africa looked like. And I think that critical geography gave me the lens, gave me the tools to critique that perspective a little bit and think differently about how I was thinking about Africa.
Did this passion for engaging in activist geography spark you to work with refugees then in Seattle?
Yeah, I mean, before then, the work on HIV and AIDS, I was trying to marry together the research I was doing in activist work around treatment action, which now, in Ghana at least, but in other places, I think we're in a much better position in terms of having access to treatment, affordable treatment. But I had a longer-standing interest in refugee geographies and migration geographies through my mentorship with Adrian Bailey. And when I finished my master's at the University of Washington, I I was getting more interested in refugee studies, and I had two students. I was a teaching assistant, and two of my students in two consecutive semesters were from South Sudan, and they became really close friends and have been really important. So they were my research assistants for my doctoral dissertation, and I was there. One of them did a master's in public health. I was her research assistant, and then we've traveled together to South Sudan many times since then, and I'm collaborating with one of them now on a research project. So we've developed a very long-standing relationship. But initially, when they were my students, they introduced me to some of the challenges that they were facing as refugees in their community in Seattle, and some of their amazing activism in terms of engaging with their communities back home. And so my doctoral work really came out of that. I volunteered in Seattle with the refugee community for several years, and also traveled with them as they started to return home to South Sudan, what became South Sudan. But at that time, it was in this transitional period that was very exciting between the signing of the peace agreement in 2005 and the eventual independence in 2011. So that overlapped with my doctoral dissertation sort of time, and I was really interested in nationalism and the important work of refugee communities in building the nation. So.
Well, it's indeed fascinating, because I recall after reading some of your works, you discuss some of the connections between South Sudan and those refugees that have experienced essentially this diasporic phenomenon in the U.S. And there's this connection that at times is frayed and at times is very strong. It's very confusing in many ways for the refugees, as it can be for many immigrants.
Right. Oh, sure.
And it's interesting that somebody from the outside can document that particular phenomenon.
Well, it resonated for me actually with my dad's experience. He has a very sort of nostalgic memory of Guyana, even though it was under British colonial rule. And then he also has very mixed feelings about having left, and has a lot of homesickness, and he's in many ways been in exile for a long time. So the people I was working with from South Sudan that would talk about memory and nostalgia and home and belonging, for me that really resonated with my father's own sort of conversations about home, and of my family who are scattered all over, their sort of long-standing ties to home, but at the same time very fraught ties. So it resonated. Yeah.
It's interesting, as they have this nostalgia, that they tend to concentrate more on the good things than on the bad things.
Sure.
And it was difficult at times in those interviews to perhaps generate some honest memories.
Yeah, I don't know really what an honest memory means, right? Because part of what I was interested in is the sort of emotion-laden politics of remembering that are bound up with loss, but also hope. And I think it's true that that sometimes, for example, listening to my father, I would have to step away from our conversations and read, analyses of what happened in Guyana to really understand some of the important racial and nationalist and colonial policies in place that perhaps for my dad, were sort of articulated in more nostalgic ways or not. But for my respondents for the doctoral research, sure, I would have to balance some of the political and economic histories with their stories. But I thought that their stories actually were really, really important in recounting the conflict and also the peace process and the hopes for the new nation, which are very fraught, even as we speak.
Certainly. Do you have any advice you can give to students or those that may conduct field research as to how to develop trust with those subjects that one is discussing, examining?
Well, yeah,
through these interviews. I mean, you became really a trusted member of their community.
Well, sometimes and sometimes not. I mean, sometimes I was regarded with a lot of suspicion, not just because I was an outsider, but because, you know, sometimes being from Britain, or sometimes I was assumed to be from the north of Sudan. You know, people have a set of connections that they make, and so sometimes it can really help you to be an outsider, and sometimes it can be it can lead to a lot of suspicion. And I think feminist geographers have actually written a lot about building trust and ethics in the research encounter. And one of the earliest chapters I remember loving was this chapter by Rabina Mohammed on insiders and outsiders, and her work with Pakistani women in Britain. And I think about that piece a lot because those tensions are really prevalent. And I think as long as you're thinking about them and engaging with them and reflecting on them in the fieldwork, that's one really important step. I think it's not enough to worry about it. I think it's also really important to engage politically and in the research that you're doing. And so I volunteered for a long time with one of the organizations that I work with called the South Sudan Women's Empowerment Network. I spent a lot of time on conference calls and in meetings and in field sites where we were working. And over time, then you can build trust and friendship with people around you. But it doesn't mean that when we do workshops with new people that there aren't tensions. But I think like that piece, putting that work in, has been important for me at least. I think that everyone should approach their research in a way that works for them and the people they're working with. But for me, that was really important, the sort of long volunteer piece.
Engaging in that sort of activism really facilitated your propensity to be empathetic to their
I think so.
Their lives.
Yeah, I think so in some way. And I think there were skills that I had that I could bring to the table. Like I could maybe do some grant writing, or I could write the report, and then the women I was working with, they would have different skills they could bring. Like they might be really great MC and be able to facilitate conversation at some of the conferences, or they might be a really good organizer. And so, or they might really be well connected to the community, and so we would draw on different skills together to build the work that we were doing, the activist work or the research project. The project I'm working on right now with one of my student from 10 years ago, she's doing the work connecting with the community. We're creating a survey to look at return and South Sudanese from the US who are returning to South Sudan and the work they're doing. And so she's doing the amazing work of sort of connecting with the community and making sure that the survey makes sense to them and pilots it, and that's a huge amount of work. And then I'm doing other pieces of the project that make sense.
That's great. I have a question about relating to the women and listening to their stories. I recall in one of your pieces you discussed this woman named Jacqueline, a pseudonym. Her story is heartbreaking in some ways. Can you just speak for a moment about that story?
Yeah, I mean, she was talking about domestic violence in the home and the challenges that she had with her protecting her young daughters from that kind of violence too, and the importance that she attributed to getting education and being able to sort of move out of some of the challenges that she had faced her whole life in Sudan. I think that there are a lot of really sad stories that can come out of the kind of research that is concerned with refugee communities, and Jacqueline's story is one of those stories. But she really told that story as part of a way to engage with the development community, so that she could to tell another story. Really, like it's a story of sorrow, but really she's saying at the end that look what I was able to do and how I've been able to move forward. And I think that's the piece of the story that often gets left out of refugee studies, is that we see this terrible, tragic account of people's loss and exile, but we don't hear enough about the amazing work that they're doing to rebuild their communities, and often the long distance work that they're doing from Detroit and from Los Angeles and from London and Kampala and all over the world to connect back to their families in South Sudan. And so I do think her story is a sad one, but I also think it's a story that's filled with hope, you know.
That's great. You know, you've talked about this inspiration really that you've gotten from these people that you've studied, that you've worked with in terms of research assistants that you've had. What about geographers that have assisted you along the way? Do you have any comments about some of your mentors?
Sure. Well, I talked about some of those mentors at Leeds, right, that were really important for me at an earlier age. And then, I mean, I came to University of Washington to work with Lucy Jarosz, who's just a fantastic feminist geographer and radical geographer and awesome, you know, an awesome person all around. And you know, she and Vicki Lawson were two really important figures for me, two strong feminist geographers. And then Kim England too, I had read a lot of her work and loved her work, and she's just been a really important figure in feminist geography too. So there are lots of great faculty at UW, and it's an exciting space. Michael Brown's work as a sort of queer political geographer was really important too. You know, Jonathan Mayer as a medical geographer was important. So there was a lot of great work going on there. And then, you know, for me too, Mona Damosh's work has been really important. I'm perhaps it's because they were friends, I'm not sure, but Adrian Bailey, as an undergrad, gave me a piece by Mona Damosh to read on department stores. And I loved this piece so much. And, you know, it was years before I really met Mona and got to know her, but I remember thinking, oh, this is the kind of geography I would really love to do, you know, this rich sort of historical feminist geography. And, you know, I'm still working towards that, but she's been a really important figure.
That's
too.
great. We just have a moment or two left, and I'm going to ask you if you have any advice for students majoring in geography or graduate students in geography as they seek to complete their dissertations or pursue their studies.
Oh, it doesn't feel that long ago that I was a graduate student, so. Well, I think that's really important that you study something that you're passionate about, that you're really excited about. I think that's really, really important. And I think reaching out to people around you that inspire you is really important. For me, it's just been really important to have mentors that, you know, just 4 or 5 people along the way. Cynthia Enlow is another one. That, I've, you know, I love their work, and I've just tried to be a little bit brave and reach out to them and tell them who I am, and you know, sort of stalk them at conferences and that sort of thing. And you know, Audrey Kobayashi, I read her paper when I was 19, and now she's, you know, I just finished a paper on her work, and she's just been really important. And I think finding those mentors is really important.
That's, I think, very profound advice. And I'll close this session for now, and thank you very much, Caroline, for joining us.
Great.
This closes Conversation with the Geographer, and we look forward to your talk tonight.
Thanks so much.